Chapter 14. At evening, time light. One morning, Lisha woke up so discouraged that after breakfast and chores, he went to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. He wondered how he could manage with all his problems. He had borrowed money to enlarge his livery stable. Now the note would come due in a few days, and he didn't have the money. Chat came in and found him. She looked him over with a worried expression on her face. "What's the matter, Alicia? Are you sick?" "Everything's gone wrong," he said. "Money problems. Big ones. And on top of that, you want to join the Adventist church." For a moment, Chat did not speak. Alicia tried to read her thoughts. She looked so serious and yet so calm. "Maybe I shouldn't join the church." With a rush of tenderness, Lisha remembered that Chat had never opposed him, had always done what he wanted. He threw his arms around her. "Chat, don't ever let anyone stand between you and your convictions. Not me or anyone else." The meetings came to a close. Lisha went willingly to witness the baptism in the creek by old Fort Ellis. Chat and three of his children, Pearl, Claude, and Ruby, followed their Lord's example and received baptism that day. Lisha watched Chat's face as she rose from the water and thought he had never seen it so beautiful. Mrs. Reynolds met her at the water's edge and embraced her with tender kisses and weeping. Lisha led his family away to the warm clothes he had ready for them. In the days that followed, Lisha thought about baptism. Somehow he felt that he had made his discovery of God and had accepted him on that anthill in the Sioux camp so long ago. He had never doubted God since that night. He surely didn't need any church to bind him to God. The cords were already strong and true. Now it seemed to Lisha that everything moved faster. The children grew so rapidly. Charlie went away from home to work, and Lee went into Bozeman to stay with Uncle Elliot and Aunt Susan and attend high school there. Elliot still held to his infidel beliefs and often talked to Lee about them. The boys' science study at high school, together with Uncle Elliot's persuasion, influenced Lee. Lisha and Chat could both see it. One weekend when Lee came home, he tried to show his mother why she must be mistaken about her new religion. "Mama, how old is the earth?" "About 6,000 years since God fitted it up for man at creation." She studied his face. "Why do you ask?" "Well, you see, science has proved that it is much older." Lee gathered enthusiasm as he talked. "Actually, the Bible has been discovered to be only a collection of myths and folklore." Chat sat down stunned, not because she had no answer for Lee's argument, but because her precious son had already embraced his Uncle Elliot's infidel beliefs. Lee stood looking at her. Did he mistake her shocked silence for confusion? "Just give me one of those Advent books of yours," he said. "I'll study it, and I'll come back and tell you how wrong they are." Without answering any of his arguments, Chat stepped to the bookcase and selected Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation by Uriah Smith. She handed it to him. "Now, Lee, if you can honestly think, after reading this book, that the Bible is only folklore, I will have nothing further to say. But be sure to return the book soon. Your father has been studying it, and he will want it back." "Thank you, Mother." Lee made ready to depart. "I'll bring it back in a week or so." Days passed. Weeks passed. A month passed. Then one day Chat stopped Lee. "When are you going to bring my book back?" "Do I have to bring it back so soon, Mother?" He smiled down at her. "I find it most interesting, and I'd like to keep it a while longer." More weeks passed. What could Lee be doing with that book? Lisha and Chat asked that question often. Then one Friday, Lee came home with the book. He handed it to his mother and said, Mama, I'm ready to join your church. Chat could not speak from astonishment and joy. She threw her arms about her son and wept for gladness. Then Lee explained that he had studied the prophecies of Daniel and the Revelation and could see that God must indeed have shown the prophets Daniel and John the history of the future events that would happen hundreds and thousands of years from their time. Only God could have such foreknowledge. So another one of Lish's children accepted God's truth and joined the church. In 1904, Adventist believers in the Gallatin numbered only a few. 5 families lived in Cottonwood Canyon, 20 miles south of Bozeman. Several families lived in Bozeman, and Lisha and his family lived at Fort Ellis. The Reynolds family had moved away. All of these people felt a deep concern for their children. Should they not be educated in a church school? They talked it over and decided to rent a house in Bozeman and employ a teacher. They built a little church, and the following year they moved the school to the church, building and enlarged it to include 10 grades. 28 children attended school that year. More and more, Lisha found his thinking and his planning shaped by the faith that his family had embraced. He began to extend his vision to the future beyond this life, to the hope of everlasting life. He understood it now. Jesus would confer immortality on his people at his second coming. On the night of the first school program, Lisha and Chat sat together in the audience. Lisha looked around the room and liked what he saw. The students seemed bright and happy. They even acted friendly towards their teachers. His mind went back to his own brief school days. The schoolmaster usually wore out several willow switches every day. The students expected to be cuffed and slapped, or at least rapped across the knuckles with a ruler. All his young companions had considered the teacher an enemy to be endured or dealt with according to the weapon they possessed. Now he watched the members of the little school orchestra take their places. He listened with surprise and pleasure to the opening number. Lisha glanced around at the audience and saw his own pride and delight mirrored on every face. He sensed that this church school managed children and educated them in a different way from what he had experienced. On the way home, he told Chat that the school had convinced him of the value of Christian education. Lisha often pondered on the strange way he had been led among the many dangers and temptations of his pioneer life, now bound up closely in a family and a community of people who taught temperance and lived by Christian ideals. He saw his children growing up with the influence of the church and the church school strong upon them. Never among all the thrilling adventures and the wild excitements of the gold camps had he felt so much satisfaction. No period of his life had been so blessed. By 1906, the school had grown too large to be accommodated longer in the church building, and the men of the church decided to find larger quarters, land where they could build a permanent school with dormitories for boarding students who lived too far away to drive back and forth every day. They wanted a place in the country where the students could work on a farm and where industries could be developed to assist the students financially, as well as to furnish training in useful skills. Lisha offered them 20 acres of land at half its value, and they accepted his offer. So, Mount Ellis Academy came into being on the very land where Lisha had taken up his squatter's claim when Bozeman itself was but a dream of brave pioneers. Swifter than a weaver's shuttles, the years fled by. Bozeman had come into good and prosperous times and fulfilled all the expectations that Eliot, John Bozeman, and William Beale had cherished in the days when Indians roamed the wilderness and the land lay in virgin solitude. Eliot's good and generous wife, Susan, passed to her rest. Now Eliot, grown old and lonely, lived by himself in his big brick house. His children had gone to homes of their own. He comforted himself by roving through the streets of Bozeman, marking all the growth and the many surprising developments that took place every year. He seemed to take personal pleasure in the town's prosperity. With pride, he looked on the towering grain elevators in the humming flour mills. The mention of how he and John Bozeman had persuaded McCodds and Cover to invest in the mills always brought a smile to his lined face, which still retained its early fierceness. The McCod Culver Mill had been the first commercial mill in Montana. The curtain was lowering on the pioneer days in Bozeman. The old actors had passed off the stage. Eliot often walked past their graves in the cemetery, and he knew that he would soon find his place there too. He decided to sell his home in town and spend the remaining years of his life with Lisha and his family at Fort Ellis. The tie between the brothers had always been strong, and never was it more so than now, when Eliot, old, bitter, and lonely, came for comfort to Lisha's home. The townspeople had always spoken of the strong resemblance between the Rouse brothers. Now they seemed not at all alike. Eliot smoked constantly on his old pipe and drank to excess. These habits, together with his cynical unbelief, made him irritable and cranky. Lisha presented a marked contrast. Firmly situated in the heart of a genuine Christian family, with gentle chat and her sweet influence always drawing him toward good and better things. With his large family being educated in a Christian school and trained for Christian service, Lisha now enjoyed the golden time of his life. Although not a church member, he took great pride in his children's development and all their plans. He neither smoked nor drank, and he taught his boys the evils of tobacco and liquor. He enjoyed frolicking with his children and taking part in their fun. One hot afternoon in July, Eliot's life ended. He had been helping Lisha's boys prepare irrigation ditches when he suddenly collapsed from a heart attack. Loving hands laid him to rest beside Susan in Sunset Hill Cemetery, where John Bozeman had been buried so many years before. Eliot had come back to rest at last on the land that he had once had been part of his squatter's claim. Time had left its mark on Lisha and Chat. Now a new generation of youngsters called them Grandpa and Grandma. Like the land whose rugged features civilization had softened, their faces had altered with the years, and their voices had softened and gentled. From the time that Chat had joined the church, she had conducted family worship. Every day the family gathered, and always in the prayers they pleaded for Papa to join them in open acknowledgement of his faith in God and all the church stood for. Yet they attended church and prayer meeting without him. I can't bear to think of your father being taken by a heart attack like Uncle Elliot, Chat said to Pearl one day. It's important to his soul's salvation that he give himself to God openly and join the church. I can't understand it, Pearl said. He seemed the most enthusiastic of all of us when he first heard the truth. Remember how convinced he was about the Sabbath? Early one Sunday evening in 1850, two of Lish's young people, Claude and Ruby, prepared to drive into Bozeman to attend a meeting R.D. Quinn, a family friend, would speak that evening. "Why don't you come with us, Papa? Wouldn't you like to hear Elder Quinn?" Ruby had already climbed into the buggy. "Elder Quinn? Well, yes, I'd like to hear him, but I'm afraid I'll make you late." "We'll wait for you," Claude assured him. Lisha could see that the family seemed amazed that he would go along to church. He didn't quite know himself why he wanted to go tonight. He got ready, came out, and climbed into the buggy with Claude and Ruby. They drove into Bozeman. Lisha felt that Elder Quinn must have prepared the sermon with him in mind. He felt the drawing power of the Holy Spirit work with mighty effect on his heart and mind. The presence he could not explain stirred the deepest level of his soul. Elder Quinn closed his sermon with an appeal to all who accepted Christ as their personal Savior to come forward. Lisha rose and went forward to the altar, and a peace he had never before imagined filled his being. At the close of the meeting, he was baptized. Chad and the children rejoiced as only those who have waited long years can rejoice. Now on Sabbath mornings, the white-haired patriarch led his family across the road from his house to the chapel at Mount Ellis Academy, where services were conducted. For years, Lisha had lived and worked and survived in the wild and lawless land ruled by the gun and the knife. For many years, he had scouted for the army and taken part in battles with the Indians. For 11 years, he had been a policeman in Bozeman and carried a gun everywhere he went. Many times in his life, he had used the six gun and the rifle with deadly effect. Now, instead of a gun, an open Bible lay on his lap. He followed the preacher's text with grave interest. Sometimes he caught Chat's affectionate eyes upon him, and knew that she compared him to the young and wild Lisha she had married. Then he reached for her hand and smiled at her. Lisha had come to the 75th year of his life when one day Nelson Story came to visit him. The heroic old man was 90 years old. His life also had been filled with adventure. The fame of his cattle drives and his fearless encounter with the wild Indians and wild road agents made the stuff of thrilling stories for the youngsters who sat listening at Grandpa Rouse's home that day. "Not many of us old timers are left, Lisha," Nelson Story said as he left the house. "Soon we'll be sleeping out there on the hill with Elliot and John Bozeman and the others." Lisha replied, "You know, Nelson, I believe the best is yet to be." About a month after Nelson's last visit, Lisha and Chat arose early one morning. With Lee and Claude, they paused to read Psalm 91 and have prayer. Lee and Claude then hurried away to a neighbor's ranch to fire up the old steam engine and oil the machinery for the day's threshing. After breakfast, Lisha put on his hat and left the house on foot for town. Returning from Bozeman, Lisha passed by the neighbor's place where Lee and Claude were harvesting at the time. The men were washing up for supper after a hard day's work when he arrived. Although urged to stay and eat with the crew, he declined, explaining that he had been gone all day and Chat would worry about him. One wonders about his thoughts might have been as he approached the railroad crossing that evening. Gratitude for the golden grain that poured into the wagon box at harvest time, reminiscence of his encounter with Indians only 40 or 50 rods before that crossing, The old lawless days when men like Plummer and Stinson fell into the hands of vigilantes. Engrossed in his thoughts and quite deaf, he watched a freight train pass, then stepped in front of an engine on the other track. Years have come and gone since that tragedy. Those who pioneered the West have long since passed away. Elisha's children have scattered. His grandchildren and great grandchildren have lived in many parts of the world, some serving missionaries, doctors, nurses, teachers, and ministers. But the object for which he labored, a settlement in the wilderness of western Montana, where peace, order, and prosperity reigned, has been fully realized.